They mocked the quiet wife in Ikoyi, but before the night ended on Banana Island, the man who spat at her would learn that Lagos' applause can vanish the moment truth takes the mic. The Durojaya mansion blazed like a wedding cake of light, its marble floors polished until even the chandeliers admired themselves. Staff and white gloves ferried trays of peppered snails and small chops, while a string quartet tried to make old money sound like virtue. At the head of a long mahogany table sat Richard Durojaye, chest out, chin high, a Lagos prince of the balance sheet. To his right, his mother Margaret perched with that permanent frown that measured pedigree like currency. And somewhere midway down, wrapped in a sky-blue aso oke that refused to shout, sat Amaka Okoye Durojaye, the woman everyone had decided was scenery. Guests from Victoria Island and Lekki Phase 1 tilted their glasses, talking stock and soft power, pretending not to notice the way Richard's laughter rolled like a generator drowning smaller sounds. Daniel, the younger brother with a grin that promised mischief other people would pay for, poured more wine and traded whispers about an international expansion that would make Durojaye the name on every West African port. Clara Adenye, Amaka's friend since youth fellowship days in Yaba, sat close enough to take Amaka's hand and far enough to keep Richard in the corner of her eye. She told herself it was vigilance, not gravity, pulling her gaze. When the toasts began, Richard rose with the practiced swagger of a man who loves mirrors and microphones, blessing family, legacy, and boldness, savoring each word like suya. The table clinked on command. Then he turned the room into a stage and pointed at the quietest actor. "Amaka, say something for once," he said, a smile too sharp to be kind, and head swiveled the way Lagos traffic does when sirens pass. Amaka lifted her glass, steady, unhurried, and replied softly that his words were already enough for the night. Laughter pinched at the corners of mouths, Margaret sniffed, a wife should have presence, and Daniel's chuckle skated across the table like spilled palm oil. It could have ended with petty malice, but pride always wants an encore. Richard leaned forward, his voice rising, cutting her down with the lazy cruelty of a man certain the room is his. "Empty, Amaka, you bring nothing. How did I marry silence?" And because men who mistake attention for authority always want proof, he spat, an ugly, hot, shameless thing toward her plate. The quartet faltered, forks stilled, someone's champagne sighed. Shame climbed the walls like harmattan dust, and for a heartbeat, Lagos itself seemed to step back from the table. Amaka flinched only once, then her hands, those careful hands that keep ledgers exact and teacups unchipped, took a napkin from Clara without trembling. She blotted the stain the way she has always treated pain, privately, precisely, moving it from public spectacle into a small, containable square. Richard laughed again louder, like a man paid to be humiliating. "Look how it suits her. Pathetic." A few guests forced chuckles. Most swallowed hard and studied the pattern on their plates. The portraits of long-dead Durojayes watched with painted indifference. It would have been easy, respectable even, for Amaka to rise and leave, to retreat to the women's lounge with clean tears and the comfort of gentle lies. But she knew Lagos. She knew that walking away at the wrong time is how you donate your story to the people who harm you. So she stayed. She adjusted the fold of her jele, lifted her glass again, and said two words with a calm that made the air colder. "To family." The blessing landed like a verdict. Margaret's smile stalled. Daniel stopped mid-smirk. Even the staff blinked as if a door had opened on a quieter, older power.
Clara squeezed Amaka's fingers beneath the table and whispered, "We can go now." Amaka's answer was a breath that tasted like iron. "If I leave, they will rename tonight Victory. Let them keep their noise. I will keep the record." The meal limped on, conversation stitched together with nervous thread. Richard performing invincibility, Vanessa Eze breezing in late with glossy apologies and a red dress that announced itself like a siren. When chairs finally scraped and good nights pretended to be sincere, Amaka remained the last at the table, smoothing the napkin flat, studying the stain like a map. In the glass of a darkened window, her reflection did not look broken. It looked busy. Lagos has a way of teaching you that the loudest voice is not always the one with the file. Somewhere between Ikoyi and Alausa, between a key pressed warm against skin and a signature nobody remembers watching, a reckoning had already begun, and it would not ask Richard's permission to arrive.
Night settled over Ikoyi like a velvet wrapper as the last valet whistle faded and the Durojaye mansion exhaled its guests. Amaka walked the quiet corridor alone, the stain on her sky-blue asoke drying into a dull bruise that matched nothing in her wardrobe and everything in her memory. Then slipped into the small study at the far end where the house finally stopped performing and became honest. Wooden desk, humming lamp, shelves of ledgers that smelled of ink and rain. She closed the door, twisted the latch with the soft certainty of someone who has practiced privacy, and reached beneath her blouse for the thin chain that carried a key most people would mistake for decoration. The lower drawer slid open to reveal what Lagos rumor never counts when it tallies power. CAC filings stamped at Alausa, share transfer deeds witnessed in a quiet chambers on our lower road, trustee letters that once moved funds from a grandmother's prudent estate in Enugu into a shell that bought what male pride would have pawned. Years earlier, when Durosan's receivables aged into trouble and vendors in Apapa began to demand cash up front, when banks tightened covenants and the loudest executives missed the fine print, she had poured lifeblood into the company without confetti, routing capital through Okoye Family Trust II, taking majority quietly because loud generosity rots, and leaving Richard the costume he required to continue his parades. She spread the papers like a tailor laying cloth, checking each scene, special resolutions, board notices that were sent and mysteriously misplaced, director acknowledgments bearing signatures that preferred not to remember themselves. 90% was not theater but arithmetic, and she did the math again to steady her breath. A knock sounded, and Clara Adeni entered with 2 mugs of ginger tea and the kind of pity that warms and weakens. Amaka accepted the cup, grateful for heat more than comfort, and listened as Clara called Richard cruel, Margaret pompous, Daniel dangerous with ideas borrowed from louder men. "Leave," Clara urged, pressing fingers into Amaka's palm, eyes wide with sisterly urgency. "Take a week in Enugu with your aunt. Let them chew them noise without you." Amaka smiled with only one corner of her mouth. "Noise is their diet," she said, "but policy is mine. If I go now, the story will dress itself in their fabric." Clara's gaze fell to the desk, lingering a heartbeat too long on a certificate embossed with the CAC seal. Curiosity flared across her face like a match, then died behind loyalty's mask. She rose to go, promising to check on the staff and make sure no gossip escaped the kitchen. And Amaka believed her, yet when the door clicked shut, Clara did not turn toward the back hallway. She drifted down the side entrance into the garden, where fountains whispered and the hibiscus held secrets, and there found Richard Durojaye leaning against stone, a cigar ember pulsing like a heartbeat. He greeted her with that well-practiced intimacy that makes foolishness feel like chosenness. He spoke of chemistry, of a wife who never understood momentum, of divorce papers softening in a drawer, of an expansion to Eco Atlantic that would put de Rossen's logo on the horizon. Clara's conscience reared and then knelt. She told herself she was gathering intel for Amaka, but she stayed too long in the warm circle of his voice, accepted a compliment that knew exactly where to land, and let a small, disloyal hope bloom where loyalty should have stood guard. Inside, Amaka returned each document to its sleeve, replaced the divider tabs the way she arranged her own breath, measured in, measured out, then wrote 3 notes in a clean, steady hand. To Mrs. Funke Aderemi, company secretary, requesting certified copies. To Barrister Tunde Balogun, instructing him to prepare a boardroom pack and sit ready at Eco Hotels and Suites. And to the driver, booking an early run to beat the unpredictable bridge traffic from Ikoyi to Victoria Island. She wasn't plotting revenge, she was setting governance back on its rails. Before she turned off the lamp, she stood at the window and watched the city grid pulse. Generator lights, hawkers' torches, red eyes of traffic inching, lives being balanced against fuel prices and school fees. And she thought of junior staff whose salaries should not hinge on a man's need to look larger than his shadow. In that glass, her reflection did not ask for fairness, it asked for order. Down in the garden, Richard told Clara to go before anyone saw. Upstairs, Amaka slipped the key back beneath her blouse and felt it warm against her skin. A small sun with the patience of dawn.
Morning slid into Ikoyi on the back of honking denfos and the bittersweet smell of diesel, and with it came a choreography that looked ordinary to the street but felt like strategy to the house. By 6, Auntie Ngozi had pressed a dove-gray asooke that refused drama. By 6:30, Mrs. Funke Aderemi, company secretary, replied to Amaka's midnight note with a clipped, certified copies ready. Originals will ride with counsel. By 7, Barrister Tunde Balogun confirmed the board pack in a black briefcase and the presence of an independent observer from the audit committee. By 7:10, the driver eased the Prado out through the gates, nose toward the Ikoyi-Lekki link bridge, praying for mercy from traffic gods who seldom grant it twice. Lagos fanned awake along the route, joggers tracing the lagoon's edge, vendors stacking oranges into small pyramids, radio hosts in Pidgin arguing about fuel queues, while inside the car, Amaka reread the timeline as if it were a psalm. The year receivable soured, the month vendor patience snapped. The day she moved capital through Okoye Family Trust too. The afternoon the CAC at Aluza stamped her transfer deed. The evening Richard took a bow he hadn't earned. She wasn't nervous, she was precise. Across town in Victoria Island, Richard de Rojaya rehearsed lines at Eco Hotels and Suites, playing with phrases like continental footprint, Eco Atlantic anchor, and history favors the bold. And Daniel clicked through slides built to impress the easily dazzled. ARPU forecasts that ignored currency shocks, debt schedules disguised as optimism, a covenant note pushed into an appendix as if footnotes cannot bite. Margaret arrived in head-to-toe gold, greeting directors with the smile of a matriarch who mistakes pedigree for power. Vanessa Eze floated in red, a walking headline who had learned how to be seen without saying anything that would live in minutes. Clara Adeni hovered at the edge of the ballroom smell, coffee, perfume, polished ambition, telling herself she had come to support family, though her pulse betrayed the pull of Richard's orbit. When she texted Amaka, "Here if you need me," she believed it even as she reread Richard's late-night sentence about divorce, as if words could sign themselves. The Echo Convention Center crew set nameplates, wired microphones, and checked the LED wall. Alhaji Ibrahim Bello, the independent chair, retained for the AGM season, reviewed the agenda with the patient air of a man who has seen companies survive brilliance and die of swagger. At 8:40, Mrs. Aderemi met Tunde at a side entrance. She took the briefcase like a sacrament and locked it in a drawer behind the dais, then practiced the sentence she would use if challenged. "We will proceed according to the Companies and Allied Matters Act." In the corridor, junior staff from Surulere and Aja whispered about allowances and school fees, how expansion sounded like a flag until someone had to pay for the poll. Their hopes beat quietly against the room's theatrics.
At 8:55, the Prado rolled under the portico. Amaka stepped out with the calm of a woman who has spent nights with ledgers instead of lullabies. Her gele tied lower than fashion, so eyes would land on her face and then on the file. Phones tilted. A rumor moved like breeze through raffia. Now Madame Widom they underestimate be this? And then stilled as she walked. Richard saw her from the stage lip and felt a quick, unwelcome memory of the dinner he swore had been forgotten. Pride swatted it away like a mosquito. He kissed Vanessa's knuckles as if the moment could learn its place, signaled to the MC, and the lights warmed. Formalities clicked. Opening prayer, adoption of last minutes, auditor's report. In the second row, Clara looked back at the doors as if truth might walk in late and tell her which side of herself to choose. On cue, Richard launched, velocity, vision, verticals. His voice a spine for slides that stacked certainty atop speculation. Applause found him easily. Margaret's rings tapped approval on the armrest like a metronome. When the chair called for questions, a director raised debt service ratios, and Daniel answered with a grin that turned math into a mood. The room leaned toward a vote. That was when Mrs. Adiremi cleared her throat and said, "Before the vote, the company secretary notes receipt of additional filings relevant to ownership and voting rights." The sentence fell like rain on zinc, sharp, undeniable. Heads turned. Richard's smile stiffened. Tunde rose from the side aisle with the briefcase. Amaka stood without haste, the way a steward stands to correct a chart, not to stage a coup. Lagos continued roaring outside, horns, waves, markets opening. But inside the hall it felt as if the city had folded its noise to listen.
Silence tightened like a drumskin as Alhaji Ibrahim Bello inclined his head, and Mrs. Funke Adoremi unlocked the drawer, lifted the black briefcase, and laid out its contents with the unshowy care of someone who knows that paper, not volume, determines fate. Embossed CAC filings slid across the dais, stamped share transfer deeds bearing dates from the crisis year, trustees' letters from Okoye Family Trust 2, board notices acknowledged by signatures that had long preferred to forget themselves, and a clean, current register of members listing Amaka Okoye Durajaye at 90%, not as rumor, but as arithmetic. Barrister Tunde Balogun stood to summarize, voice level, referencing the Companies and Allied Matters Act 2020, ownership, voting rights, and the board's duty to proceed on verified fact. He asked counsel to authenticate seals and dates while the chair maintained order. A soft rustle moved through the Echo Convention Center as the legal team compared filing numbers to the CAC portal printouts, cross-checked trustee resolutions, and traced the chain from the year vendors in Apapa demanded cash up front to the present moment when Swagger had tried to outrun debt service. Richard Dirajaye forced a laugh that didn't travel. "This is theater," he said, palms up, charisma doing push-ups and finding no muscle to borrow. A domestic quarrel dragged into a corporate floor. Margaret's bangles chimed as she slapped an armrest. "We built this with our name." And Daniel leaned forward, eyes flicking across numbers like a gambler looking for one more card. Vanessa Eze adjusted her red sleeve and learned, efficiently, the difference between headline and minutes. Clara Adeniyi half turned in her chair, stared at the certificates the way a believer stares at a miracle she had prayed against. Memory burned, the stain on blue osooke, a garden ember, a drawer left a finger's width, a choice rehearsed as concern. "Counsel?" the chair prompted. The company lawyer rose, glasses catching light. "The filings are genuine. Seals, dates, and acknowledgments reconcile. The register accords with these transfers. There is no legal basis to proceed as if Mr. Dirajaye holds control." The sentence landed like first rain on dusty ground. No anger, only clarity. Alhaji Bello nodded once. "Then we will follow the law. Madam Company Secretary, read the proposed resolution." Mrs. Adaremi stood, steady. Suspension of the expansion agenda pending independent audit of liquidity and covenants. Immediate removal of Mr. Richard Durajaye as Chief Executive Officer. Appointment of Mrs. Amaka Okoye Durajaye as Executive Chair on an interim basis with authority to constitute a risk committee and stabilize vendor relations. Direction to publish a market statement before close of business. A low wave rolled the hall, shock, then relief from rows where junior staff kept mental ledgers of rent, fuel, and school fees. Richard surged to his feet, microphone flaring. "You can't. She's my wife. This is vendetta." "This is governance," Alhaji Bello said, not unkindly, palm down. "If you have a substantive objection, ground it in statute." Richard's mouth opened, closed. Charisma is not a statute. The vote went to a show of hands among eligible members, then, at Richard's insistence, to a poll. Mrs. Adaremi and Tunde supervised while council watched. Numbers returned implacable. The resolution carried. Margaret's face settled into a mask that had failed to frighten history. Daniel's grin died into calculus, already hunting new angles that did not exist. Vanessa Eze texted no one, and tucked herself neatly out of consequence. Clara Adenieyi pressed fingers to her lips as if to hold in a confession. Instead, she looked at Amaka, who had neither smiled nor trembled, only signed where lines asked for stewardship. "Mrs. Okoye Durajaye," the chair said, offering the mic. Amaka rose, voice low and even, Lagos in its unshowy register. "We will honor obligations, audit exposures, and earn back trust. Expansion is not canceled. It is sequenced. Staff welfare is not a footnote. It is policy. Vendors will be paid on agreed terms. We will speak to the market before close of business." She turned once toward Richard, not triumph, not cruelty, only boundary. "You spat at me in a dining room, but this is not a dining room. Here the record speaks." Outside, horns braided with surf. Inside, pens moved, directives formed. Risk committee by noon, vendor calls by 2. A draft released to the NSE by 4. As the hall rose, applause began at the back where the least powerful recognized the shape of stability. It traveled forward, careful at first, then certain, while in the front row, one woman who had practiced silence for years stood straighter, not larger. Power had changed address without shouting.
By noon, the Echo Convention Center had emptied of spectacle and filled with work, and Amaka moved through its repurposed green room, now a war room, with the sure pace of someone who understands that stability is a sequence, not a speech. Mrs. Funke Adaremi set up a folding table as command desk. Barrister Tunde pinned a whiteboard schedule, risk committee by 12:30, vendor triage at 13, bank calls at 14, draft market statement to the Nigerian Exchange, NGX, by 16. And junior staff from Surulaire and Aja formed a relay for coffee, printouts, and names that mattered. Amaka dialed vendors first because supply chains remember who calls them early. She started with a steel fabricator in Mile 2 who had been waiting 90 days. "We will honor 40% now, balance in tranches. You'll have a signed schedule before close." Then a logistics outfit in Apapa where diesel costs had turned invoices into prayer points. Her voice stayed even, her promises measurable, and by the third call, the tone on the other end had shifted from skepticism to that cautious respect Lagos reserves for people who do exactly what they say. She waved in Auntie Ngozi with a tray of meat pies and water, crises starved thinking, and listened as audit chair Mrs. Kehinde Oyalola briefed on an external firm from Marina ready to test covenants and model the expansion's cash bleed amid FX volatility. Amaka authorized scope, set a 2-week first cut, and insisted on a dashboard that a junior analyst could explain to his mother. Outside, Richard Durajaya lingered near the ballroom doors like a dethroned MC, dialing allies whose phones suddenly discovered bad network. Margaret gathered her gele and dignity into a single tight knot and told a director that blood is thicker than filings, only to find that the Companies and Allied Matters Act recognizes neither proverb nor pedigree. Daniel slipped into a quiet corner to message a private equity contact in South Africa, pitching himself as continuity, but the man replied with a link to the NGX rulebook and a polite circle back after audit. Vanessa Ase left through the service exit without malice or mess, heels clicking a fluent goodbye learned in other cities. In the war room, Clara Adeyemi hovered on the threshold clutching a notebook. Shame rode her shoulders in a weight she could not disguise, yet she stepped forward when Amaka looked up and said, "If you mean it, sit. HR has a list of junior staff with school fee arrears. Start a welfare roster and confirm disbursements by Friday." Clara nodded, throat tight. She took HR, took names, and felt something inside her unclench. Not absolution, but assignment. At 13:05, the Risk Committee convened in a side conference room. Mrs. Oyolola, Tunde, the treasurer, a hard-eyed finance manager from Yaba, and Amaka at the head, sleeves neat, Ken capped. They killed the Europe hub for now, mothballed the Echo Atlantic billboard campaign, and rephased CapEx to match actual inflows. They also wrote a simple rule on the glass with a marker: no debt drawn without hedge plan signed, and beneath it, Amaka added, no staff laid off to fund a speech. By 13:40, she crossed to a smaller room where the youngest employees waited in a row of stackable chairs, interns from Unilag, fresh hires from LASU and UNN, faces bright and worried. She told them plainly that salaries would land on time and that a hardship fund would cover emergencies for anyone brave enough to ask. A hand went up. "Madam, if we speak truth, will we still have jobs?" And Amaka cracked the smallest smile. "If you speak truth with a solution attached, you will have my attention and my protection." At 14:10, the call with the bank on Broad Street began with stiffness. Relationship managers excel at cautious, but thawed when Amaka volunteered to send the audit scope, the vendor schedule, and the hedging rule. She accepted a slightly higher margin in exchange for covenant relief on the next 2 quarters, and wrote, "Reprice after audit" in the margin of her notebook, the way farmers mark rain dates. Somewhere in the corridor, Richard finally found words. He cornered Clara with a whisper sharp as a paper cut. "You owe me." And Clara shook her head, not so much as brave as done. "I owe rent, school fees for my niece, and a company that isn't a dare." And she walked past him into the room where her list had grown to 27 names. By 5 p.m., Mrs. Adaremi read back the market statement: leadership transition, expansion paused pending audit, vendor repayment scheduled, welfare fund constituted, risk controls adopted. Alhaji Bello reviewed, council trimmed adjectives, and Amaka added one sentence: "We will grow low and wide before we grow tall." At 15:40, she crossed to a smaller room where the youngest employees waited in a row of stackable chairs, interns from Unilag, fresh hires from LASU and UNN, faces bright and worried. She told them plainly that salaries would land on time and that a hardship fund would cover emergencies for anyone brave enough to ask. A hand went up. "Madam, if we speak truth, will we still have jobs?" And Amaka cracked the smallest smile. "If you speak truth with a solution attached, you will have my attention and my protection." At 14:10, the call with the bank on Broad Street began with stiffness. Relationship managers excel at cautious, but thawed when Amaka volunteered to send the audit scope, the vendor schedule, and the hedging rule. She accepted a slightly higher margin in exchange for covenant relief on the next 2 quarters, and wrote "reprice after audit" in the margin of her notebook, the way farmers mark rain dates. Somewhere in the corridor, Richard finally found words. He cornered Clara with a whisper sharp as a paper cut. "You owe me." And Clara shook her head, not so much as brave as done. "I owe rent, school fees for my niece, and a company that isn't a dare." And she walked past him into the room where her list had grown to 27 names. By 1500, Mrs. Adaremi read back the market statement: leadership transition, expansion paused pending audit, vendor repayment scheduled, welfare fund constituted, risk controls adopted. Alhaji Bello reviewed, council trimmed adjectives, and Amaka added one sentence: "We will grow low and wide before we grow tall." At 15:40, she called the receptionist at Ekoi HQ and asked her to tell the security team that everyone would leave tonight with a cab voucher if the rains began. At 15:55, she texted the driver to be ready for a quick run to Marina in the morning. When the release hit at 16:03, the first reply came not from an investor, but from the steel fabricator in Mile 2. "I received the schedule. I will deliver Thursday." Amaka exhaled once, deeply, then circled deliverables versus declarations on the whiteboard and underlined it twice. Outside, Lagos traffic began its evening chorus, and inside, a company quietly remembered how to breathe.
Rain gathered over Victoria Island like a promise and broke just after 5, drumming the hotel awnings, while Scene 6 unfolded in movements so small they could be missed by anyone listening only for thunder. Amaka kept the war room humming, but now she stepped sideways into places where narratives are born: press calls, staff corridors, and the narrow spaces between policy and perception. First, she recorded a 2-minute message for internal channels from a quiet corner near the service elevators. No grand backdrop, just a plain wall and a steady voice. "We will audit, repay, and protect. Speak up to your manager if you're carrying a secret fire at home, she said, naming school fees, hospital bills, and rent, making private worry legitimate work. Clara, eyes red but hands reliable, uploaded the clip to the intranet and sent it to department heads with a bold line instruction: acknowledge receipt, attach one concrete action you will take this week. In the ballroom, Mrs. Funke Aderemi and Tunde fielded calls from a cautious financial press. Amaka joined one on speaker, resisting the temptation to didactic elegance. No, we did not cancel growth, she said. We resequenced. There's a difference between height and foundation. Outside in the corridor, Richard Doroyaye moved like a man rehearsing a comeback trajectory, cornering two mid-level managers from Yaba and Ikeja with the familiar promise that history would correct this momentary fever. Their smiles were the brittle kind employees use to exit a conversation without violence. Margaret, wrapped in the kind of gold that tries to argue with rain, phoned a family ally in Ikoyi to convene an elders meeting, but the elder, who also chaired a pension fund, replied that elders follow the law when pensions are at stake. Daniel, damp hair plastered back, slipped into the media room and tried to trade anonymous quotes for softer headlines, only to discover that editors had already replaced his adjectives with Amaka's numbers. Momentum is a poor currency when receipts circulate. The audit kickoff happened in a side suite with the carpet still smelling new. Mrs. Kehende Oyelola introduced the external firm's leads by first names only: Kola, FX Modeling; Ifeoma, Vendor Verification; Musa, Covenant Testing. And Amakar set the tone in a single instruction: build me a dashboard a driver can explain to his wife without printing 3 pages. They agreed on a 10 a.m. daily stand-up and a rule for red flags: no surprises after noon. Back in the war room, Auntie Ngozi handed out paper plates and drew the blinds against lightning. Food quieted panic where policy couldn't. A junior from Surulere approached Clara with a whisper about a sick mother in a jeje. Without ceremony, Clara walked him to HR and sat until he left with a signed voucher and a promise that did not depend on who liked him. From the lobby, a security supervisor texted that the rain was pooling at the entrance and 2 staff had no transport. Amaka replied with a blanket instruction: cab vouchers to anyone stranded, overtime capped, attendance not to be weaponized tomorrow. At 6:10, Echo Atlantic called about the billboard they'd booked. Amaka paused, then said, hold the slot for 90 days, roll the payment to Q3, and swap the image. No skyline, just the line, we pay what we owe. If they ask why, tell them the brand is telling the truth on purpose. Somewhere between phone and whiteboard, Richard finally tried law. His personal counsel emailed a blustering letter alleging marital prejudice masquerading as corporate action, and Tunde answered with a lean 2-paragraph reply attaching the register, citing Kama, and inviting any further correspondence to address statutes, not sentiment. The rain softened to a patient hiss. At 6:30, Amaka walked the back corridors, past AV cases, past staff wiping down cables, introducing herself by first name and asking one question: what is the smallest fix that would make tomorrow kinder? She wrote the answers in a pocket notebook. More surge protectors in accounts. Tea at 10 a.m. in logistics. A standing rule that pregnant staff get front row parking without asking twice. Outside the service stores, she paused beneath the awning, breathing the wet air, and thought of the Ikoyi house where silence had once felt like safety. Power, she realized, was not the roar in a grand hall, but the accumulation of kept promises in small rooms. Clara joined her there, hair curled by humidity. I told him no, she said. Eyes steady now. Tell me where to be tomorrow. Amaka nodded toward the list in her hand. Be at HR by 9. The ground remembers feet that walk it in peace. In that instant, the generator hummed. The light steadied, and Lagos recalibrated around a company unlearning spectacle. When they returned to the war room, the first vendor email blinked green, followed by a second, dispatch restored, delivery Friday. And the junior from Surulere sent a 3-word message to Clara, "Mummy is covered." Amaka capped her pen, drew a small box on the whiteboard labeled Mercy Budget, and ringed it once. The thunder had moved offshore. The work remained onshore, exact and human.
Dawn rinsed Lagos Island in pale gold and diesel, and Scene 7 began not with headlines but with doors. Glass doors at Dorosan HQ Ikoyi, sliding open to let in a woman who had decided that permanence would look like small, correct things done in sequence. Amaka arrived at 7:28 with her notebook and a calm that made the lobby guards stand a little straighter, greeted the receptionist by name, and asked IT for the first action of the day: convert spectacle into systems. By 7:40, access lists updated on the console. Richard Dorojai's executive privileges suspended. Guest passes narrowed to business necessity. Daniel's finance folder set to view, not edit. And a new distribution group created, Welfare at Dorosan, where staff could route private needs without begging managers who collected favors like stamps. Mrs. Funke Adaremi read out the day's cadence at a stand-up in the boardroom with the lagoon winking through the glass. Audit stand-up at 10, vendor payment run at 11:30, lunch and learn for interns at 13, how to read a covenant so it doesn't bite you, bank covenant call at 14:15, press follow-up at 16. The whiteboard carried yesterday's sentence in thick marker: deliverables greater than declarations. And under it, Amaka wrote, "No one is punished for telling the truth early." In the corridor, a courier delivered a stiff envelope stamped with a family crest. Margaret had summoned elders to an evening sit-down in Ikoyi to restore order. Amaka penciled a one-line reply: "Order is already restored. Governance will attend to all further matters." Meanwhile, Richard arrived without the fanfare he once demanded. A smaller man inside a good suit, pausing when his badge flashed amber. Security was courteous but firm. "Sir, your pass is limited to reception and legal." And the receptionist offered him tea with the neutral kindness that belongs to people whose jobs keep their dignity. He asked to see the board. He was shown the calendar. He asked for a private room. Legal offered a conference space with glass walls. He paced there, making calls. Phones rang, then didn't. Daniel, late and damp from the morning's quick rain, slipped into accounting to ask for printouts. He left with summaries, not levers, realizing that power had become process, and process had learned to lock drawers. In a small HR room, Clara Adani and a compact woman from payroll triaged the first batch of welfare emails. Medical bills from Ajage, a landlord in Aja threatening a staffer, a mother in Surulere asking if a partial payment might keep her daughter in school. Clara matched each note to a budget line and a name. It wasn't absolution, but it was work tilted toward mercy. And mercy, she learned, trains your spine. At 10 o'clock, the audit stand-up in Marina kicked off on video. Kola reported early FX scenarios. Ifeoma flagged 3 vendors who were actually one company with 3 names. Musa drew a red box around a covenant that everyone had ignored because the old story was louder. Amaka asked for 1 slide per red flag and insisted that each risk carry a proposed fix in the same breath. "No museum of problems," she said. At 11:15, she walked the operations floor, where fans chopped the humid air and staff wore last night under their eyes. She stopped at cubes, asked for first names, heard small truths. Power outages at the warehouse are killing timelines. Procurement approvals die in email, and wrote them down, marking quick wins. Generator maintenance schedule, a 1-day experiment with delegated signatures for low-value purchases. Richard tried again near noon,
intercepting her outside the glass-walled legal room with a voice that remembered microphones. "Amaka, we can negotiate, split roles, show a united front." She studied him as if he were a dial that once worked. "We will always share history," she said, soft as a reprimand. "But the company is not a marriage counseling prop. Send substantive proposals to legal. Sentiment has no inbox." Behind her, Mrs. Adaremi moved like a metronome, countersigning vendor tranches, confirming NGX filings, prepping a memo that defined leadership contact policy so no one had to read mind or mood. At 1300, the interns crowded into a training room. Unilag, LASU, UNN badges pinned to thrifted blazers. And Amaka taught them how to read a cash flow graph without fainting, how to ask a question that earns respect, and why height without foundation collapses in Lagos rain. An intern asked if truth could get you fired, and she answered the way she'd promised. "Not while I'm here. Attach a fix." At 1415, the bank on Broad Street came on the line with a covenants manager who had practiced skepticism. By 1432, the call had turned into partnership, relief on 2 ratios, a signed side letter, and a shared calendar for check-ins. Amaka ended with, "We will reprice post-audit," and the manager said, to his surprise, "We look forward to it." In the lobby, Auntie Ngozi set a cooler of sachet water next to a basket of bananas, small fuel for tired brains, and a handwritten sign, "Take, replace with kindness later." By mid-afternoon, the first batch payments hit vendors' phones. The steel fabricator from Mile 2 texted a photo of welding sparks, "Back on your order," and the logistics outfit in Apapa sent a dispatch manifest stamped Friday. The press follow-up came at 4. Amaka corrected a headline, "Sacks husband," to "Removes CEO per register and comma," and offered numbers instead of adjectives. The reporter paused and then asked for a future interview on leadership without noise. At 1640, Margaret's driver called reception to announce her arrival. Amaka asked legal to receive her and booked 5 minutes in a glass room where truth could not hide. When mother and daughter-in-law faced each other, Margaret opened with lineage and sacrifice, and Amaka closed with payroll and law. "A name is not an invoice," she said, gentle and final. Evening crept in with generator hum and the soft shuffle of staff heading home. A security guard saluted Amaka with the understated respect Lagos gives to people who do not waste others' time. She looked at the whiteboard one last time, added a new line, "Kindness policy, default to help," and circled tomorrow's first task, warehouse power. Outside, the city did what cities do, forgot yesterday's theater and remembered rent. Inside, a company learned the sound of steadiness.
Evening folded itself over Ikoyi with the quiet confidence of a city that has already seen the day's verdict, and Scene 8 arrived without banners. Trucks nosed through Apapa with Dorosan consignment stamped from Mile 2. The warehouse generator in Ilupeju coughed back to life after a rushed service, and a line of junior staff drifted out of HQ holding cab vouchers like small shields against the rain. Inside, Amaka stood one last time at the boardroom window, the lagoon dark and honest, while her phone hummed with confirmations. Vendor tranche posted, bank side letter returned, audit stand-up materials queued for 10 a.m., welfare payments authorized to 3 households in Ageje, Aja, and Surulere. The so-called elders meeting in Ikoyi tried to gather itself into relevance, but when Margaret arrived in gold and spoke of lineage, the oldest voice in the room, who also chaired a pension fund, answered that pensions sleep best under law. Margaret's shoulders lowered by a degree only family would notice, and she said nothing when someone suggested a public appeal. Daniel, who had spent the afternoon discovering that charisma does not log into restricted folders, walked the marina curb alone, phone warm in his palm, composing messages he could not send because none of them contained numbers. In the end, he texted Amaka one sentence: "I can be useful under rules," and received back 2 words: "Bring receipts." Richard Durojaye met his own echo in a glass conference room at HQ, where the night guard's reflection became a second witness to his calls. He tried fury first, then nostalgia, then a settlement shaped like a story, but every number he offered skittered under the light, and when he finally pressed dial on a friend who always answered, the ringtone ran and ran and ran. Claudia Adenyi, finishing a spreadsheet in HR with a biro bitten down to the plastic, printed the welfare roster, slipped it into a dull gray folder, and walked it to Amaka's desk. She didn't ask for absolution, and none was offered, only a nod and an assignment for tomorrow, onboarding a kindness policy that made help a default and privacy a right. At Eco Hotel and Suites, the LED wall that had been booked to boast about continental footprint rolled an all-black slate for a minute at a time between corporate bookings, each interval carrying the same line in small white letters: "We pay what we owe," and no logo. Brand by behavior had begun. The first audit flags landed at 9 p.m. in an email subject line that did not panic: 3 related party vendors disguised as competition, an FX exposure that had learned to hide in miscellaneous, a covenant ratio that wanted to turn red in week 9. Kola, Ifeoma, and Musa attached 1-page fixes, exactly as Amaka demanded: clean hedges, vendor consolidation with new terms, and a cash buffer drawn not from salaries but from paused vanity spend. She replied with a single instruction: implement pre-approval, report exceptions at 10, and shut the laptop as if closing a door on old weather. In the small things, the company exhaled. The security supervisor reported that 2 women had reached Ajegonle with cab vouchers intact. Accounts sent a photo of new surge protectors labeled and dated. A receptionist forwarded thanks from a staffer whose mother's hospital deposit was now paid from the Mercy budget. Somewhere quiet in Yakaba, a UNLIG intern wrote in a notebook: deliverables greater than declarations, and underlined it twice. Markets noticed in their slow way. The night editor at a cautious financial daily changed a headline from boardroom drama to order restored at Dorasan, audit, vendor payments begin, and the markets desk scheduled a sidebar on sequencing growth. Near midnight, Auntie Ngozi clicked off the last quarter light, leaving a tray of bananas and sachet water beneath a handwritten note: take, replace with kindness later. And the cleaner from Makoko, who started at 4, wrote thank you back in pencil. At home, Amaka stood in her silent Ikoyi study, the key warm against her skin, and let the room ask its old question: is this power? To which she answered not with a speech, but by laying tomorrow's list on the desk: warehouse power audit, vendor consolidation brief, intern's lunch and learn on cash flows, bank check-in, press note to clarify that growth was not canceled, only sequenced. She did not think of triumph. She thought of payroll on Friday and of a proverb her grandmother used in Enugu: the ground remembers feet that walk it in peace. In the version of the story that Lagos would tell, because cities always tell a story, there had been a dramatic boardroom and a public dethroning, but the conclusion lived here: a company unlearning spectacle, learning to keep promises, and a woman whose quiet became policy. As for Richard, men who braid identity with applause must sometimes apprentice themselves to silence. If he ever learns, Amaka would accept a substantive proposal at legal, not a memory at her door. Outside, the lagoon breathed. Inside, the ledger balanced enough to sleep. And in the morning, when doors slid open and lights warmed, Doro-san would go to work, not taller yet, but steadier, growing low and wide before it reached for height.